Week 4 is all about advanced user input. You've already learned a little bit about the input box function. We've done just the simplified version where we've just said x equals input box, and then we have some sort of prompt. So we've typically used this bottom format here, but the input box function has a couple of other arguments, optional arguments. I want to kind of go through these optional arguments to show you how we can do more things with the input box function. So in this example, I've got my prompt, please enter something. I've got the title, which is I've named Charlie's input, and then I've got a default value here of 7. And what we're going to do is we're going to obtain that from a user. I'm just dimming this as a variant, and then it's going to message box that. So now I've included those optional arguments. We have Charlie's input, that's the title, and we have 7, that's the default value. And when we go through this, you see that the title on this input box is Charlie's input. We still have the prompt, but now we have a default value. So that default value of 7 is in there. For example, if the user will most of the time be entering a certain value or a string or so on, then you can make that a default value to save them some time. Similarly, if I delete this and I press OK or cancel, I'll press OK this time. There's a type mismatch because x was dimmed as an integer and not a string. If x were dimmed as a string, then x would be just empty quotations, which is an acceptable string, but then that would be caught using our input validation. Now I want to introduce the input box method. We can use application.inputBox. We have a prompt, title, we have all these optional arguments. We could change the default, we could change the x and y positions, and there's all sorts of other things. The most common are the prompt, title, default, and type. The type, there are different codes. If you want the type that they can input into the input box to only be a formula, the type would be 0, 1 for a number, 2 for a string, and so on. And the nice thing about this numbering method is that you can combine codes. So if you wanted the input box to accept numbers and strings, then you can add those two, and you could use a 3 for a number or a string. So let me show you a couple examples related to this. So I'm dimming x as a variant. That's the most common using this application.inputBox, especially if you're specifying different types at the end here. And I'll explain a little bit about that in a minute. But here we've got in a do loop, so we can do input validation. We obtain x in this input box method, application.inputBox. We have our prompt, we have our title, we have a default value, and the type. The type here, if I go back to the codes, is a string. So this input box is only going to accept strings. So if I run through this, then we bring up this input box. And if I just leave it as a 7 can be interpreted as a string, or I could write in something like hello, and that's interpreted as a string. So when we run this, then we see down here in the locals window that x is hello, and we have our input validation. It's not false, and I'll explain why I put false there in a minute, and then we message box that. One of the really nice things about the application.inputBox is it's sort of got a built-in input validation. What I mean is if I change this type to 1, then that means the input box is only going to accept numbers. The type code for number is 1. So if I run through this and I put in a string is not a number. So when I press enter, it's already got this input validation that's sort of built in, which is nice. So then it sort of leaves this box up and the user has to input something again. So maybe we'll put in an 8 there, and since 8 is a number, then we go through and do everything as expected. I put a false here because the application.inputBox method, when you go through this, if I press cancel, then you see that x has been given a value of false. And I can use that in my input validation. If you don't have the input validation, it'll give you kind of an error. And now I can trap that error, so that cancel, we have a false. We're going to only get a false when that cancel button is pressed. So if x is not equal to false, then we exit the do and we continue. Otherwise, if it is false, then we let the user know they didn't enter anything, please try again. We can also deal with the problem of them pressing OK when nothing has been input into the input box. In that case, I like to put a type 3 here. We can use numbers and strings. So if we run through this, and for whatever reason they just delete everything in that input box and they press OK, the result is an empty quotation. What I can do is add in an and, x not equal to empty quotations, then we exit do. So if one or more of these are true, then we stay inside the loop and we say you didn't enter anything. So let's go ahead and run through this. If for whatever reason the user just inputs a blank input box, then we are trapped inside that loop. We don't exit, and it tells them they didn't enter anything, and it asks them for this again. This is just sort of some advanced input validation using the input box method.